bank sold reserves, increasing the supply of foreign currency on the foreign exchange market, increasing the demand for, or reducing reducing the demand for reducing the demand, the supply of domestic currency, and this defending the exchange rate. This is my interpretation of what you take from this, what you get from this picture. Now, just let me add this. Now, two things are interesting and worth noting here. The first thing is Turkey doesn't have an exchange rate target, right? It's not that Turkey has if you ask the Turkish Central Bank, what is your monetary policy framework? They would say, we do inflation targeting. And then when you say, do you target the exchange rate? They will say, no, 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 no. But apparently in this moment they did. Otherwise you cannot explain the evolution of reserves. Secondly, this evolution could also, I mean, why did the central bank step in to basically stabilize the exchange rate? It could have been financial markets stepping in. I mean, it could have been that financial markets, right at the moment when the pandemic happens and the Turkish economy is in a dire state, they discover their appetite for Turkish assets, right? It could have been that not delta R shifted, but this thing shifted to the left, meaning that Turkey would have been allowed to sell more liabilities. But that's apparently not what happened for various reasons. So the central bank had to do the trick. The central bank had to do the intervention, and it did so massively apparently to prevent a massive depreciation of the Turkish lira. And as I said, the Central Bank of Turkey does not have an official exchange rate target, which you see down here, right? There's nothing on that slide because you could have, you can draw it in there. It's like one of these children's books where you have these blank spaces and you can add stuff. Now let me, before the lunch break, let me chat a little bit about exchange rate regimes in practice. Now with a fixed exchange rate, what monetary authorities usually have, and it's usually the central bank, they establish so-called target zones. So target zones are bands where within the exchange rate may fluctuate. And interventions take place whenever the exchange rate threatens to leave the target zone. So suppose you have, this is the so-called parity, and you establish a band around the parity, and this can be 2.5% on top, 2.5% below. Sometimes these bands are very narrow, sometimes they're wide. Now what central banks do when they target the exchange rate, they say, okay, we do nothing as long as the exchange rate is in the band. And here there's depreciation pressure, right? It seems like the nominal exchange rate is leaving the band, and then the authorities intervene by buying domestic currency and sell foreign currency. And then the foreign exchange reserves decrease. And suppose this is successful and the nominal exchange rate goes in the other direction, and then there's appreciation pressure, and the nominal exchange rate is about to leave the band to cross the lower boundary. Then in this case, the monetary authorities intervene by selling domestic currency and by buying foreign currency, and the foreign exchange reserves increase. But that's how you should envision, the reality of exchange rate regimes. It's not that, first of all, in most countries, the exchange rate regime, the fixed exchange rate regime, does not mean that You're only allowed to exchange at a given exchange rate. That used to be the case in the GDR, East Germany, before the fall of the Berlin Wall. You had to go, you went there, and you had to exchange your West Deutschmarks into GDR marks at an exchange rate that was mandated, right? So and in fact, you had to exchange a certain amount of money, and you got these East marks, and you didn't really know how to spend them. So people usually bought books and musical scores. What happens if the exchange rate is very far away from what the markets want? Well, black markets. And so in the GDR, you had huge black markets of black foreign exchange markets, where the exchange rate was completely different from what was the officially announced thing. Now, this still exists, I guess, in some parts of the world, but in Vietnam, for example, it's not, Vietnam is very close to a market system, right? So Vietnam, the State Bank of Vietnam, and you can talk about this to Dr. Ha, because he was very much involved in designing the current system. State Bank of Vietnam influences the nominal exchange rate, but considering market forces. All right, now in addition to pure floats and pure pegs, there's many intermediate forms of exchange rate regimes, right? We can distinguish between a hard peg, traditional peg, intermediate regimes, and this is taken from a book by Ghosh, Gulde, and Wolf, who classify exchange rate regimes, and they go from the hard peg to the floating regime, and they say there's a lot of intermediate stages, right? Now, this is when you go to the International Monetary Fund's annual reports on exchange. What is it called? Annual reports on exchange arrangements and exchange regimes. AREAER. So they're called the annual reports. And some countries have hard pegs, some countries have soft pegs, some countries have floating regimes, and some countries have so-called other managed arrangements, right? And so you can go it's like going from black to white, and in the middle you have gray. And you have different shades of gray, to put it. An exchange rate arrangement with no separate legal tender is when you don't have your own currency. A currency board arrangement is what Bulgaria has, for example. It's a very tight peg where the monetary base is completely supported by foreign currency. Then you have a conventional pegged arrangement where you announce a peg, but you're allowed to change it. You have a pegged exchange with horizontal bands where you allow the exchange rate to fluctuate quite substantially. You have a stabilized arrangement where you intervene in a discretionary way. You have a crawling peg where you let the exchange rate follow a path that you have announced, and you have a crawl-like arrangement which is even more flexible. Then you have a float where you let the exchange rate float, but you sometimes intervene, and the free float is you don't intervene at all. All right. What's this? This from the annual reports. This is small print. So I've cut and pasted page 4,849 and 4,850 from the annual reports, just to show you the entry of Vietnam. You can't read that. I can't read it either. What's written there is the de jure exchange arrangement, blah, 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 is a managed floating system and it's determined, blah, blah, blah. And then they say the de facto arrangement is somewhat different. It's a stabilized arrangement. So the IMF, if you want to know what is the exchange rate regime of Vietnam, you Google annual reports on exchange rate arrangement and exchange regimes and exchange restrictions, And you can download this and you can go to page 4849, and you can know what is the exchange rate regime of Vietnam. And you learn what the exchange rate regime about Thailand is because their Thailand page and so on and so forth. This is from my book, and you see that the relative popularity of exchange rate regimes has changed over time. In 1970, most of the countries of the so-called Western Hemisphere had a fixed exchange rate regime. That was the so-called Bretton Woods arrangement, when basically all European, Latin American, and North American countries and a lot of other countries agreed to have fixed exchange rates. And then the Bretton Woods system exploded in the early 70s. And then countries were free to pick other exchange rate regimes. And you see that now today we have some countries having pegs, some countries having floats, and some countries having something in between. Something in between means you do influence the exchange rate, but you don't do it as much as someone who has an official peg would do it. All right. I think that's a good point in time to take a break. Because bottom forward rates like that's will take us another 15 minutes to get. Now, let's take a break until 1, right? I'll be back here at 1. And then my plan is I'll give you some time to go into the last problem of yesterday's problem set 6. Maybe not an hour and a half, but just an hour, because I think it's doable quite quickly. Maybe you need even less. Then we talk about that. Then this is done. And then I'll spend the rest of the afternoon lecturing, right? Which is, very, it's strenuous for both you and me, but on the other hand, we have to cover some ground. Now, tomorrow is the last day, and I'm confident that we'll manage to finish this this thing on the nominal exchange rate. If not, we'll certainly do the 7th problem set, and we'll also do the mock exam. The mock exam is not an exam that you have to do here and you get graded, but it's supposed to give you an idea of what the exam will look like, right? That's important information, I guess. Okay, so take a break and enjoy your lunch, and we'll see each other at 1.